Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're really going back in time to unlock the secrets of memory.
Ah, yes, memoir.
Specifically, we're going to be diving deep into this book called The Trained Memory by Warren Hilton,
Okay.
published way back in 1920.
1920, so over 100 years ago.
Over 100 years ago, yeah. Now, some of you might be thinking, a book about memory that's over 100 years old? What could that possibly have to teach us today?
Yeah. I mean, we've learned so much about how the brain works since then, haven't we?
That's what I thought too, but honestly, going through this book, I was really blown away by how much of what Hilton talks about is still so relevant today.
Really? Like what?
Well, he asks questions like, how much do we actually remember?
Hmm.
Can we access those memories that we think are lost forever?
That's a good question. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm always curious about that.
And why do some people just seem to have this knack for remembering things while others struggle?
Yeah. Yeah, some people just like walking encyclopedias.
I know, it's crazy. So one of the things that Hilton does right off the bat is he breaks down memory into 4 key elements:
Okay.
retention, recall, imagination, and recognition.
Interesting. So it's not just about remembering facts and figures.
Exactly. It's more than just memorizing lists or dates. It's about how we hold on to experiences, how we bring them back to mind, how we visualize them, and how we understand their significance in our lives.
I like that. It's a more holistic approach to memory.
Now, here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Hilton argues that we retain way more than we realize.
Mm-hmm.
But most of it is buried deep down in our subconscious. It's
Yeah.
like this treasure vault.
A treasure vault.
But we've lost the combination.
I like that analogy. So how do we find the combination then?
Well, that's what we're going to be exploring. And Hilton uses these captivating anecdotes to illustrate this point.
Okay, I'm all ears.
One that really stood out to me was the story of this servant girl who, during a fever, started speaking languages that she had never consciously learned.
Wow, that's crazy.
And it turned out she had absorbed these languages just from overhearing her scholar employer reading aloud. Subconsciously, she had picked up these languages without even realizing it.
That's pretty amazing. It makes you wonder what's lurking beneath the surface of our own minds. What kind of potential is just waiting to be tapped into.
I know, right? It makes you think. And there are other stories in the book, too.
Like what?
There's one about a man who recovered his forgotten Welsh after a head injury.
Wow.
These stories, while anecdotal, really point to this idea that our minds are capable of storing so much more than we consciously access on a daily basis.
Right. So there's all this information hidden away.
Yeah.
But the question is, how do we get to it? How do we unlock it?
Well, that leads us to Hilton's exploration of the mechanisms of recall.
Mechanisms of recall.
And he introduces this concept he calls complexes,
Complexes.
which are basically these interconnected groups of ideas, emotions, and even physical reactions.
So like a whole web of experiences, not just isolated bits of information.
Precisely. He gives an example of how remembering a traumatic event can bring back all these physical sensations that you felt at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've definitely experienced that. Like certain smells can trigger vivid memories.
Exactly. It's not just the memory of the event itself, but all these associated sensations and emotions that come flooding back. It's like the smell is the key that unlocks the whole complex.
It's amazing how our minds work like that, isn't it? So these complexes play a role in recall, but is there anything else that influences what we remember easily and what we seem to forget?
That's where it gets even more fascinating. Hilton suggests that what we readily recall is heavily influenced by our interests and goals.
Oh, interesting.
He believes that a chosen life aim actually acts like a magnet, drawing related information to the forefront of our minds and allowing other things to fade.
So our brains are kind of filtering what's important based on what we're focused on in life.
Exactly. Think about it. If you're really passionate about something, you're naturally going to pay more attention to related information, you're going to think about it more, and you're more likely to remember it.
That makes sense. It's like our brains are constantly trying to be efficient, prioritizing what seems most relevant at the time.
Right. It's not necessarily about intentional forgetting. It's just that some things naturally become more prominent in our minds based on our current focus. And this leads us to Hilton's laws of recall.
Okay, laws of recall. I'm intrigued.
He outlines 3 main laws that explain why some memories surface easily while others remain buried. He calls them the law of integral recall, the law of contiguity, and the law of frequency and intensity.
Right, break those down for me.
Well, the law of integral recall, the first one, states that stimulating just one element within a complex can trigger recall of the entire thing.
So like a chain reaction. one memory sparking another.
Exactly. It's like how a single scent can suddenly transport you back to a specific moment in your childhood with all the emotions and details flooding back.
Wow. I've definitely experienced that. It's amazing how powerful those sensory triggers can be.
It really is. And the second law, the law of contiguity, explains why that happens. It suggests that things we experience close together in time or space tend to get linked in our memories. So that smell from your childhood might be linked to a particular place, a person, or even a song. And recalling one element can trigger the whole memory cluster.
That's so interesting. So our minds are naturally creating these connections between experiences.
Exactly. It's like our brains are constantly weaving together a tapestry of memories, linking events, emotions, and sensations into these intricate patterns. And then the third law, the law of frequency and intensity, is a bit more straightforward.
Okay, tell me about that one.
This one simply states that the more vivid or frequent an experience, the stronger its imprint in our memory. So if you have a really intense emotional experience, you're much more likely to remember it vividly even years later.
Like a really joyous occasion or a traumatic event.
Exactly. Those kinds of experiences leave a deep mark on our minds. And on the flip side, if you encounter something repeatedly, it becomes easier to recall. Like think about how we learn the alphabet or multiplication tables.
Repetition, repetition, repetition. That's what they drilled into us in school. So it sounds like repetition plays a key role in memory, according to Hilton.
You'd think so, right? But here's where he throws a bit of a curveball.
Oh, how so?
He actually argues against rote memorization and cramming.
Really? But doesn't repetition strengthen memory? That's what we were just talking about.
It seems counterintuitive, I know. But his reasoning is that rote memorization and cramming don't focus on creating meaningful associations.
So it's not just about drilling information into our heads. It's about making it meaningful.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He's much more interested in understanding the material, connecting it to your existing knowledge and interests. He even has this whole thing about manufactured interest.
Manufactured interest, what's that?
It's the idea of doing things purely out of obligation or duty rather than genuine desire.
Oh, I get it. Like forcing yourself to study something you have absolutely no interest in.
Exactly. And Hilton believes that this actually hinders our ability to remember it. If you're not truly engaged with something, it's less likely to stick with you.
So even if you manage to cram all that information into your head for a test, you're probably going to forget it pretty quickly afterward.
That's what he suggests. He emphasizes the importance of finding ways to connect even mundane tasks or subjects to your passions and goals. Make it personally meaningful, and you'll be more likely to remember it.
That's a great point. It's about finding that spark of genuine interest, even in things that might not initially seem exciting.
Exactly. It's about making those connections, finding what resonates with you, and then those memories will have a much stronger hold.
This is fascinating stuff. So we've talked about how memory works, the different elements involved, the laws that govern recall, and the importance of genuine interest. But how do we actually put all of this into practice? Does Hilton offer any specific techniques for improving memory?
He does, and that's what we're going to be diving into next. He outlines what he calls a scientific memory system based on association and recall.
A scientific memory system. Sounds intriguing. All ears.
It's all about becoming more deliberate and observant in how we encode information. We'll explore the specific techniques he recommends when we get back.
This is getting really interesting. I can't wait to hear more about this system.
We'll be right back after a short break. All right, we're back and ready to dive into the nitty-gritty of Hilton's scientific memory system.
Let's do it. I'm ready to unlock those memory secrets.
Before the break, we were talking about sense observation, right? That's one of the key techniques he emphasizes.
Yeah, engaging all of your senses to make information more memorable. It's not just passively reading or hearing something. It's about actively experiencing it with all of your senses.
So it's about creating a full sensory experience, almost like you're really there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He gives this example of trying to remember a speech. Instead of just focusing on the words, pay attention to the speaker's body language, their tone of voice, even the room itself. Try to absorb the whole atmosphere. It's about creating a multi-dimensional memory of the event.
So you're creating a much richer, more vivid memory that's easier to recall later on.
Exactly. It's like taking a mental snapshot, but with all of your senses dialed up to 11. Think about it this way. If you're reading, don't just skim the words. Visualize what you're reading. Imagine yourself in the scenes being described. You could even read aloud to engage your auditory sense as well.
I see what you mean. Turning learning into a more active and immersive experience rather than just passively absorbing information.
You got it. And remember that thought observation idea we touched on before the break.
Right. Becoming more aware of our own thought processes. That one's still a bit more abstract for me.
It's all about developing that heightened awareness of your internal world. When an idea pops into your head, a creative spark, or even just a to-do item, don't just let it slip away. Grab hold of it.
Okay, so instead of letting those thoughts just vanish, we should try to really grab onto them and examine them.
Exactly. Hilton suggests dissecting those thoughts. Ask yourself, where did this idea come from? What other concepts is it connected to? Does it evoke any particular feelings or images? That process helps to solidify those thoughts in your memory.
So it's almost like becoming a scientist of our own minds.
Precisely. You're observing and analyzing your own thought processes. It's a powerful tool for anyone who does a lot of creative work, for example. By paying attention to how ideas arise and connect, you can tap into your own creative potential more effectively.
That makes sense. But I'm curious, what about remembering to actually do things? Sometimes I have a great idea, but then I get distracted or I just forget to act on it.
Ah, yes, procrastination. We all struggle with that from time to time. Well, that's where Hilton's advice on persistence in action comes in.
Persistence in action. Okay.
He's a big believer in taking action as soon as possible. Got a great idea. Don't just jot it down and forget about it. Try to implement it, even in a small way, right away.
That makes sense. But what about those times when you can't act immediately? Like you get a brilliant idea in the middle of the night.
For those situations, Hilton recommends creating strong mental associations that will act as reminders. Link the idea to a specific time, place, or object. Leave yourself a note, set a reminder on your phone, connect the idea to something you know you'll encounter later.
Building mental tripwires. I like it.
Exactly. Be proactive with your memory. Use strategies that work with how your mind naturally operates.
So, to recap, sense observation, thought observation, and persistence in action, those are the cornerstones of Hilton's scientific memory system.
You got it. But there's one more important element: repetition. But not just mindless repetition. He suggests revisiting information at regular intervals, each time trying a different approach.
So summarizing it in your own words, explaining it to someone else, trying to find a new way to apply it, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Keep your mind engaged, and you'll strengthen those neural connections.
It's about making those personal connections and finding what works best for you, not a one-size-fits-all approach.
That's the core of it. It's not about cramming your brain full of facts. It's about understanding how memory functions and then using that knowledge to your advantage.
It's amazing how many of these ideas, from a book published over 100 years ago, still hold up today.
Right. Sense observation, thought observation, spaced practice. Those are all techniques that memory experts still recommend today.
And to think, Hilton didn't have access to modern neuroscience or fancy brain imaging technology.
He was working with careful observation of human behavior and introspection. Amazing, really.
Okay, so as we move towards wrapping up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, remember that memory is not a fixed ability. It's a skill you can cultivate and improve.
It's not about how much you can remember, it's about how well you remember.
Exactly. And second, focus on remembering what truly matters to you, the information that's most relevant to your goals and interests.
Don't get bogged down trying to remember everything. Find what works best for you.
Absolutely. Embrace that journey of discovery.
You know, we've focused a lot on the positive aspects of memory, but I'm wondering, are there any potential downsides? Could there be any negative consequences to having a super sharp memory?
That's a really insightful question. And it's one that Hilton doesn't really address directly in the book. But I think it's definitely worth exploring.
I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that. We'll have to continue this conversation after a quick break. Stay with us.
Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we kind of went down this rabbit hole. You know, we've talked about all the amazing benefits of having a really good memory. But I'm still thinking about, like, are there any downsides? What are the risks of having a super sharp memory?
You know, it's a good question, and it's something that Hilton doesn't really talk about, you know. He's really focused on all the positive aspects of training your memory, but I think you bring up a good point. Any tool, any powerful tool can be used, you know, in ways that maybe aren't always so beneficial. Yeah, I mean, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, right?
Right, exactly.
So what kind of downsides could we be talking about here?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is, you know, what if you just get, like, bogged down in all the details?
Okay, yeah.
Like, if you're constantly remembering every single thing, it might be really hard to filter out what's important. You know what I mean?
Right.
You might lose the forest for the trees.
I see what you mean.
You might have trouble prioritizing and focusing on the big picture.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's almost like having a desk that's just completely covered in clutter. You can't find anything because there's just too much stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a mental clutter, and then there's the emotional side of things too.
Okay.
Like a highly trained memory could actually make those negative experiences feel even more intense.
Oh, interesting.
If you're remembering every single detail of, a painful memory, it could make it harder to let go and move on.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are definitely times when I've wished I could just erase a certain memory.
Right? Right.
Maybe a little bit of forgetting is actually healthy.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. And then there's, thinking about the social aspect as well.
How subtle.
Like, imagine being able to remember every embarrassing moment that everyone else has ever had,
Ooh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Every awkward encounter, every, social faux pas. It could make it really hard to maintain those relationships if you're constantly being reminded of their past mistakes.
I hadn't thought of that before. I guess you could say it would kind of make it harder to be forgiving.
Right. Exactly.
So I guess a really good memory isn't necessarily a recipe for success or happiness.
It's not a magic bullet.
No, for sure not. It's about finding a balance, using that ability wisely.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's a balancing act, just like, so many things in life,
Finding that sweet spot. Well, I think this has been a really incredible exploration,
Yeah, it's been a fascinating deep dive into the world of memory.
It's amazing to think that a book written over 100 years ago can still be so relevant.
I know, right? It's really inspiring.
So as we wrap up, what's one piece of advice you'd give to our listeners based on what we learned from the trained memory?
I think the biggest takeaway is that our minds are so much more powerful than we realize.
Absolutely.
And, memory is not set in stone. It's something that we can work with, we can develop, and we can use it to achieve our goals.
I love that. So don't underestimate your own mind, folks.
Right. Experiment. Explore those different techniques. Find what works for you. And just enjoy the journey.
Yeah, embrace that lifelong journey of learning.
Exactly.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure diving deep into the trained memory with you today.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Keep those minds sharp, stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.